All right, here we go. So before I really started, I was trying to figure out what in the world, how am I going to start calling these, like naming these files, these videos, due to the fact that, oh, well, as you can see here, the Arends translation nutrition, the ATA articles from German newspapers translated by William Arends. Well, some of these are now starting to fall in between live streams. And I was like, well, I guess in keeping with what happens between the Great War and World War II, let's call this the InterLiveStream. So I'm going to start this. And there's also three parts. Yet again, William Arends is able to provide ample amount of material for us. And it's just the way, the hour-long format, and also even with the after hours for the live streams every 2 weeks, you just don't have, the amount of time. So this kind of works out great to have these off weeks of not having the live stream and being able to do this recorded material. And away we go. And translator's note, these articles are from Berlin's latest news, are from the issues published on August 25th, 1917. The first, from the morning edition, is a war report that includes action in Flanders that seemed to have happened near to the time of the visit of the Kaiser to that part of the Western Front. Berlin's latest news, Saturday, August 25th, 1917, morning edition, the decline of the general offensive of the Entente. WTB, Berlin, August 24th. The Entente's general offensive slowed somewhat on August 23rd on the Flemish, French, and Russian-Romanian fronts. Only on the Italian front did the battle rage with the same intensity as during the previous days. In Flanders, fighting along the ridge was partially hampered by poor visibility and dust storms. Enemy fire was only able to increase in intensity in the afternoon and evening, at times hitting the coastal sector and our line of defenses around Ypres with full force. The partial advance carried out by the English just north of the Ypres-Menin road was bloodily crushed by our fire. 3 armored vehicles supporting the attack by enemy infantry in the Ypres area were repeatedly engaged with noticeable success. Attempts by the enemy to cross the Corbeek stream north of Langemarck were quelled by our concentrated fire. At 7 p.m., enemy positions identified near Saint-Julien were smashed by our own whirlwind of fire. Our successful advance south of the Ypres-Menin road on the morning of the 24th cleared the English nest in the Hertuggas forest. Thus, of the limited local successes achieved at the costly heavy losses, the British were left with nothing but a small remnant of Saint-Julien. Of the 21 armored vehicles destroyed, only 2 armored officers and 10 of their men were brought back alive. On August 23rd, the Canadians were again thrown mercilessly at our positions in Artois. At 6 a.m., powerful Canadian attacks against our positions from north of Lens to the southwestern beach of the city were quelled by our defensive fire. Individual groups were repulsed in close combat, inflicting heavy losses on the Canadians. Shortly after 8 a.m., the Canadians attacked again with strong forces in the area of the Souchez stream. In bitter close combat around our front line, the enemy, who fought with great bravery, was once again bloodily repulsed. We held our positions and, in the heavy fighting, captured 1 officer and about 100 men. The Canadians again suffered heavy losses. A strong partial attack on Lens-Médicourt, launched at 10 o'clock at night, was smothered by our fire, and a further enemy advance north of the Scarpe, launched at 11:20 p.m. after a heavy wave of fire, was repulsed. The town of Saint-Quentin was shelled again. In the Champagne region, after a significant increase in fire, several strong enemy assault troops advanced against our positions north of Sonnay in the evening. Just on a side note, this is the first time I've heard the Germans mention assault troops. I've heard the French mention assault troops for their own special troops. So this is neat to see. Some were caught in our defensive fire, while others were thrown back in a counterattack. Even on August 23rd, the French were unable to launch any heavy attacks with their massed divisions in the region around Verdun. The strongest attack of that day, directed by the French against the slope of Hill 304, collapsed under our artillery fire, resulted in heavy French losses. On the east bank of the Meuse, where enemy fire intensified from midday onward, a concentrated annihilating barrage prevented enemy attacks from developing. Shortly before 5 a.m. on August 24th, heavy fire began on our positions in the Avalcourt forest as far as Dead Man's Hill area. On the Eastern Front, various advances by the Russians and the Romanians were repulsed. The Italian attack subsides. WTB, Vienna, August 24th. The War Press Office reported on the evening of August 24th. Through this afternoon, enemy attack activity was relatively low. A new Russian offensive? Stockholm, August 24th. Our own wire report. The official paper, the Russian Invalid, once again reported on the reestablishment of the Russian army. My God, what a cool name. I think, or is that just being sarcastic? Who knows? Its reporter writes that it will take a considerable amount of time to complete. This reorganization is to be completed by the spring of 1918, and no military action should be undertaken until then. This presumably means an offensive. It is hardly conceivable that Russia would forego a defensive until the spring of 1918. Oh my gosh, it's so wild to know what we know and this person doesn't. Perhaps withdrawing its armies, which Archduke Joseph and Field Marshal Mackensen are still trying to break up through bloody failed attacks deep in the interior of that country. But at the same time, Russia is incapable of a large-scale general offensive. Translator's note, and we're about to stop, before we get into the actual article, we're going to read this translator's note, and then we're going to go off to a little add-on, an additional piece for this. You'll see in a minute, and the reason why. Translator's note, this second report from the evening edition is critical of a certain politician and Reichstag representative, Dr. Junk, about his proposal to allow members of the Imperial Federal Council to hold seats in the Reichstag by amending Article 9, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution of the Reich, which would draw them closer to the influence of the majority of the Reichstag. This was seen by the writers of this article as being out of step with the existing government's loyalty to the Kaiser rather than to a parliamentary majority. Internet searches yielded no information of this proposed change of Article 9, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution of the Reich, nor of the representative proposing it, Dr. Junk, during 1917. But that search said instead that this same proposal was part of the change in government that occurred in the autumn of 1918. It also said that Dr. Junk, a member of the National Liberal Party, was in a picture taken in 1918, which also included Friedrich Ebert, the future chancellor, and Matthias Erzberger, both prominent social democrats. Despite the fact that it was reporting about a proposed amendment to the Constitution that went nowhere in 1917, this opinion piece exposes the earlier cracks in the solidarity of the German imperial government, which was still dependent at this time on the Kaiser being the acknowledged and unquestioned leader of his Prussian subjects, as well the subjects of other German kingdoms, principalities, and dukedoms that made up the German Empire, through the allegiances that those kings and nobles, such as those of Bavaria and Saxony, had pledged to him. This column proves that already in August 1917, there was a call from members of the Reichstag to have increased governmental authority placed on them as the elected representatives of the German people, thereby becoming part of a constitutional monarchy with a more democratic structure. The opposition to any democratization of the institutions of government shows how the demands for such governmental reforms in Germany by the members of the Entente, as well as by the US government under President Wilson, were being met with complete resistance by the German government, which saw calls for governmental reform as being against the historical nature of the historical and established Reichs and regimes of Germany. And like I said, I'm going to pause it for a second, get to the next document that I would like to read a little bit of, and you're going to see why, and then we'll go into the actual article. Okay, I'm just going to hit pause. All right, so here we are, and as you can see, it's the Arends. We're still on with the Arends translation nutrition, the ATA articles from German newspapers, translated by William Arends. And it's the InterLiveStream 128, 129, but it's an edition for part one. And the reason being is when I started getting preparing to read this, I noticed two words that seem to almost be interchangeable within the article. And I wasn't sure. The two words are let's hold on here. I'm going to be saying them a lot anyway, so I might as well get used to it. Parliamentarianism and parliamentarism. And so I contacted William Arends. I was like, okay, is it, I'm not sure. Is it, should I use both words, leave them as is? Do you want me to use one or the other? This led to this, which is fantastic explanation by William Arends. And it adds further, well, just adds more context and more insight into, as far as I'm concerned, the inner workings of the German government, which for me has been a big cloudy bit, very opaque. I don't know very much about it. So here we go. Translator's note. It turns out that the German writer of this article did refer, as did Dr. Jung himself, to the subtle differences between the two words that refer to government led by a parliament. And I apologize that it's going to, some of these times when I go to say these words, I'm going to be slowing down, because it's still it's a bit of a mouthful for me. Both types of parliamentary rule elect the head of government, be that a chancellor or a prime minister, by a majority vote of the legislature. That head of government must then retain the confidence of the House of the legislature, or that government will fall, is to be found in the definition of both words. The subtle differences of the two words are as follows. The word parliamentarism is defined as a system where the prime minister or chancellor is the executive head of government, but the head of state might be a president with strong constitutional powers, as is the fact in modern France, where the presidency is not directly accountable to the legislature, or be a semi-presidential system, such as the case in modern Germany, where the president has some separate powers, but his or her main function is to acknowledge and recognize the will of the legislature in its backing the government with its confidence, or accepting the fall of a government through a vote of no confidence, similar to the Governor General in Canada, but with the allegiance of the president pledged to a constitution rather than a monarch. Fascinating. Thank you so much. This is just adding so many pieces to the puzzle for me. It seems that the main objection to such a system by the writer of this article was the reality that such a system would lead to a republican form of government, replacing the monarchy and the national and subordinate state governments, being run and represented by elected leaders rather than crowned heads of state. The other word, parliamentarianism, which I find for some reason much easier to pronounce, seems to be founded in the British system of government, otherwise called a constitutional monarchy, where the British crown retains its place as the head of state while constantly losing more of its governmental authority to the parliament and the prime minister. This was intimated in the article with a reference to such loss of authority by the British monarch from the time of the beheading of Charles I during the English Civil War. The continued and constant loss of authority by the monarchy in Great Britain over time was also not to the liking of the pro-establishment, pro-aristocrat, and pro-monarchical writer of this article. It is clear that the writer saw the implementation of one form of parliamentary rule just as problematic as was the other, and both were contrary to the ancient German governmental and constitutional traditions. Either parliamentarism or I can't say this one. Parliamentarianism were just two sides of the same bad coin, according to the writer and the editors of this article in Berlin's latest news. It was the ultimate heads I lose, tails you win to these supporters and upholders of German institutions and traditions. It turns out that I misread the definitions of the two variations of the words referring to a parliamentary government. Checking again, the internet told me that both words are interchangeable in their meaning of being the primacy of the legislative rule. This is a second bit, a second email that William Arends, but you're going to see in the third bit, he goes, no, all's good. It seems through that in the article, the writer, who is in favor of maintaining traditional rule by the king or the Kaiser, did not see such a distinction. Dr. Jung probably wanted to create a fine distinction between the types of parliamentary rule in order to create the illusion that adding elected representatives to the Imperial Federal Council would not inevitably lead to a government run through the Reichstag and a chancellor chosen by a parliamentary majority rather than by the Kaiser and his aristocratic councillors. In contrast to Dr. Jung and those who were supporting his change to the Constitution, the writer of this article did not see any difference in what Dr. Jung was proposing and what such a change to the government would mean for the future of the German Reich. To that extent, the writer of the article used parliamentarism when referring to the changes that Dr. Jung was proposing, and the parliamentary system or parliamentarianism when he wanted to show where such changes to the Constitution would have in the German government and its people. I apologize for any confusion that this has caused you, but this whole topic is rather complex, esoteric, and legalistic. It is fantastic, and I'm so glad you did this, William Arends. It's not funny. Still, it shows the politically tectonic tremors in 1917 that will soon become political earthquakes throughout Europe. You did an awesome job. Thank you so much for, like I said, filling in so many blanks, man. It's not funny. Now let's get back to the article. And here we are. Berlin's latest news, Saturday, August 25th, evening edition. Article 9 of the German Constitution on the attempt to repeal Article 9, Paragraph 2. The attempt to repeal the provision in the Constitution of the German Reich contained in Article 9, Paragraph 2, which states that no one may be both a member of the Imperial Federal Council, Bundesrat, and the Reichstag, which has been sought by both Social Democrats and progressives, is also finding support among the National Liberals. For example, Reichstag Representative Dr. Jung, a National Liberal Party member of the Reichstag Constitutional Committee, recently advocated in the Leipziger Tageblatt and the another paper, the knife of legislation should be used and that clause of Constitution of the Reich should be cut out, arguing that it was truly outdated and contradicted by the new idea called parliamentarism. Dr. Jung distinguishes between parliamentarism and a parliamentary system, understanding the former as the appointment of parliamentarians, Jesus Christ, to the government, while the latter allows for the appointment of the highest government officials, including the office of the Reichschancellor, on the approval and participation of the people's representatives. Whether the development of the situation in Germany will one day lead to a parliamentary system, to the transfer of executive power to parliament, and to the subjugation of the government to its will, is something that Dr. Jung does not allow to be discussed. What Jung really wants remains to be seen, but he considers the introduction of parliamentarianism to be desirable and necessary in order to establish the interconnection between the government and the representatives of the people by allowing such personalities to enter the government who are not only objectively suited for those offices, but are also parliamentarians, and to break with principle whereby the highest positions would be allocated without public scrutiny. To realize his new concept of parliamentarianism, Dr. Jung has to define anew its incompatibility, so-called inconsistency, of simultaneous membership in the Federal Council and Reichstag with the wording of Article 9, Paragraph 2, which must then, through legislative measures, be cut out of the Imperial Constitution in what he claims would be a short and painless operation. In this, he overlooks the fact that it is a legislative measure that would bring about a fundamental change in the Imperial Constitution. For this seemingly inconspicuous provision in Article 9, which was incorporated from the draft of the former government, the German Confederation, created by the Congress of Vienna in 1815, into the Constitution of the North German, a small entity formed in 1816, and dominated by Prussia and passed from there unchanged to the Imperial Constitution, expresses the essential difference between the Federal Council, Bundesrat, and the Reichstag. If the Federal Council was merely a legislative body, like the Reichstag, there would be no need for a constitutional provision. However, the Federal Council supersedes every other branch of the government, including in legislative matters, and all German heads of state participate independently in this government, with the Kaiser being entitled to the presidential rights granted to the Crown of Prussia. Unlike the members of the Reichstag, which are elected by their constituents, the members of the Federal Council, Bundesrat, are appointed to their positions by the various ruling heads of state, and are thus responsible to carry out the interests of their various states as they are instructed by those heads of state, the kings and other ruling aristocrats. Therefore, the only views that the members can express are those emanating from the leaders of the various states that make up the German Empire. These are the only views that the members of the Federal Council can express in both their House, the Bundesrat, and to the members of the Reichstag, through the table of the Federal Council there. They do not have the right to express any personally held opinions as the members of the Reichstag can. To allow members of the Reichstag to serve in the Federal Council when they are not even bound to follow instructions from their own constituents, but rather are free to express themselves on every policy and resolution as they see fit, would create an intolerable situation for the ruling Federal Council. Such a parliamentarization of the government would inevitably lead to government chaos by the lack of discipline that such a government would exhibit. In addition, on the Federal Council, Bundesrat occupies the function of an upper house in the legislative process of the Reich, and even in parliamentary states, one and the same person cannot be a member of both houses at the same time. It therefore seems that a parliamentary government, as recommended by Representative Dr. Jung, would lead to untenable conditions and to a transition to the actual transfer of power in the Reich into the hands of governments formed by alternating majorities in the Reichstag. We therefore consider it quite impossible that the National Liberal Party, whose supreme principle is the full preservation of the constitutional rights of the individual states of the Reich, could now decide to lead a helping hand to the operation with the knife of legislation deemed necessary by the Representative Dr. Jung. In any case, the governments of these individual states would not permit such an encroachment on their constitutional rights. Therefore, there can be no question of such an operation, even if a majority of the Reichstag decided to go ahead with this matter in a quick and painless way. On the contrary, this would lead to a very long and, for the German people, a very painful constitutional struggle between the Allied governments such as Baden, Bavaria, Prussia, and Saxony, and the Reichstag. Jung's idea of parliamentarization appears to have arisen from a vague understanding of the significance in the provision contained in Article 9, Paragraph 2, in connection with the position of the Federal Council under the Constitution of the Reich. It also completely ignores the fact that the current particularly strong efforts towards democratization and parliamentarization of our constitutional systems in the Reich, state and local governments, are in conflict with the conditions under which the government in our Reich and state can be conducted by a historically entrenched monarchy in cooperation with restricted parliamentary bodies. These conditions cannot be deduced from the constitutional history of England and France, as Paul Klopel has already explained in his work, 30 Years of German Constitutional History, 1867 to 1897, because the parliamentary government of England, only begins at the moment after the historical monarchy had been buried. This is probably a reference to the overthrowing and beheading of Charles I. And since then, its king has never dared to transfer more power than has been granted to him, other than in a covert and deceitful way. In France, however, these conditions can only be tested for a few years during the restoration period of the monarchy begun by the July Revolution, which led to the reign of Louis Philippe, 1830 to 1848, from the House of Bourbon Orleans, from which we can only learn the lesson of not to form such a government. The conditions for a parliamentary government, in the sober sense of having a government with the participation of a parliament, can only be seen as correct and authoritative for us if we critically consult the experiences of our own constitutional history during the past half century, independent from what can be derived from any doctrinal precedents or principles. We expect that the appointed representatives of the National Liberal Party will also take this into account when they deliberate and decide about the position that their party will take on the question of the repeal of Article 9, Paragraph 2 of the Reichsconstitution. It should be borne in mind why this constitutional provision was incorporated by the Allied governments into the draft of the North German Federal Constitution and approved without objection by the constituent Reichstag and the North German Confederation, and later by the German Reichstag. With such considerations, the right path can be found in order to create, without fundamental constitutional changes, the internal connection between the government and the representatives of the people, which was recognized as desirable and necessary according to the guiding principles of the National Liberal Party program of February 1911. Remember, the full respect for the constitutional rights of the individual states will further the development of the institutions of the Reich in a national and liberal sense. Dr. Otto Kunzmüller. Thank you so much. Hold on, let's see if we can get back to the original beginning or a little bit of the, actually I can go right straight to the boink. No, it's right there. Hold on here. Just wanted to see a bit of the title a bit more. There we go. Thank you again, William Arends. I thought that was, and I hope others did too, amazingly insightful and really, like I said, fills in a lot of holes for me about, well, lots of stuff. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed that, and we're going to be going off to part 2. Thanks again.